On a moonless winter night in 1942, a convoy of Allied merchant ships cut through icy waters, unaware of the deadly hunter stalking below. A torpedo's wake ripples through the darkness, followed by a thunderous explosion. Alarms blare, and lifeboats plunge into the frigid sea. For a moment, the Atlantic itself seems to swallow the ship whole. This was the peril Britain and her allies faced during World War II. The German U-boat, prowling unseen beneath the waves, stalking its prey virtually unopposed. By the winter of 1942, the U-boat campaign had grown so fearsome that victory was accustomed, leaving Britain cut off and on the verge of starvation. But, in the shadows of that war at sea, Allied innovations and adaptations were beginning to turn the tide. Soon, the hunters would become the hunted. In the wake of World War I, Germany's navy was all but dismantled by the Treaty of Versailles. Submarines were forbidden, but by the mid-1930s, Adolf Hitler openly rejected those restrictions and quietly rebuilt his U-boat fleet. New designs like the Type 7 and Type 9 were under construction, and by 1939, the Kriegsmarine could deploy a large and modern force. Germany's strategy was clear: wage a tonnage war, sinking more Allied merchant ships than the Allies could replace in hopes of starving Britain into submission. Karl Dönitz, a veteran of World War I submarine service, was chosen to command the U-boat arm. Dönitz insisted on aggressive group tactics. He ordered his boats to patrol in long lines across shipping lanes, maintaining radio contact. When a U-boat spotted a convoy, it would shadow it and summon nearby U-boats to converge. At nightfall, the pack would strike together, often on the surface under cover of darkness. These wolf pack attacks, multiple U-boats overwhelming a convoy, took advantage of surprise and coordination. When war broke out in September 1939, the Allies were caught off guard. The Royal Navy still held the seas, but Britain had too few anti-submarine escorts and had not yet fully established convoy procedures. In the first months of the conflict, German U-boats prowled the waters around the British Isles and Irish Sea with impunity. By spring 1940, hundreds of thousands of tons of British shipping had been sent to the bottom, straining Britain's fuel and food stocks. The fall of France in June 1940 made the threat even worse. With occupied French Atlantic ports now under German control, U-boats could sail much farther and stay at sea longer. In October 1940, U-47 slipped into the Royal Navy anchorage at Scapa Flow and sank HMS Royal Oak, proving how boldly U-boats could operate. Through late 1940 and into 1941, a period later called the First Happy Time, U-boat packs hunted from Greenland to the South Atlantic. Merchant ships, often sailing alone or in small groups, found little protection. Allied losses mounted month after month as U-boats claimed dozens of ships in each convoy battle. At this stage, the Germans had an absolute upper hand. Allied convoy defences were still primitive, and escort aircraft could not reach the mid-ocean gap. Britain began to organise more escorts and even improvised Q-ships as decoys. But for now, there was little that could match the silent wolves of the sea. In these early years, the U-boat campaign succeeded all original expectations. Yet behind the scenes, Allied planners were studying the threat and laying plans for a counterattack. For more than 2 years from 1940 to 42, the U-boats exploited every strategic advantage. The vastness of the Atlantic worked in their favour. Searching for potential U-boat threats in endless blue was like finding a needle in a haystack, and weather and darkness further concealed them. German subs were extremely stealthy underwater and had long range compared to many early escorts. They operated on the surface at night, where they were at their fastest. Allied radar and radar-equipped planes were still scarce, and radio direction finding had not yet ruled the seas. For months, the wolfpacks could strike at multiple targets in a single night, sending convoys scattering in panic. From 1940 to 1941 alone, U-boats sank well over 1 million tons of Allied shipping. if losses continued unchecked, Britain would starve. In early 1942, a new carnage began on the American side. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, Dönitz seized the moment, materializing as Operation Paukenschlag, or Drumbeat, sending long-range Type 9 U-boats across the Atlantic to America's coastal waters. Beginning in January 1942, a handful of U-boats quietly slid into the eastern seaboard and unleashed havoc unopposed against disorganized and inexperienced American convoys. In just the first 4 months, nearly 400 Allied and neutral ships, totaling over 1.5 million tons, were torpedoed along the east coast of North America, one of the great feasts of the U-boat war. German crews reported multiple prey at once, up to 10 targets in sight on some nights, all with lights blazing. By summer 1942, the U-boats even moved into the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, targeting vital oil shipments. The reach of the campaign was now global. U-boats operated in the Arctic Ocean, the Mediterranean, threatening supply routes to Malta and Russia, and all across the Atlantic. The tonnage war strategy was working. Each month, German submarines were sending thousands of sailors to their graves and crippling Allied shipping. Britain tied its hopes to Allied shipyards and American armaments. Yet, at the midpoint of 1942, with victory still uncertain, Dönitz's U-boat force had come closer than ever to strangling the Allied war effort. Britain was on rations, and every convoy wept for more escort ships and planes. Allied fortunes began to change through 1942 and into 1943 as massive countermeasures took effect. In 1941, the British had already learned convoys were vital. By 1942, the system was global. Every merchant fleet sailed in protected convoys, bringing along screen groups of destroyers, corvettes, and frigates. Special support groups detached from convoys to hunt U-boats at large. New escort carriers, small aircraft carriers built on merchant hulls, were assigned to Atlantic convoys, carrying anti-submarine planes. Merchant mariners adopted zigzag routes and tightened convoy discipline. These changes forced U-boats to gamble more to find prey. At the same time, new weapons and sensors gave the Allies an edge. Sonar, ASDIC, transmitters on escort ship hulls could detect submerged U-boats and target them with depth charges or hedgehog mortars. Meanwhile, radar detectors and centimetric radar on ships and patrol planes could spot a surfaced U-boat at night or in fog. Radio direction finding, Huff-Duff stations, tracked German convoy signals, guiding escorts to wolf packs. Each of these innovations chipped away at the U-boat's advantage of surprise. Slowly but surely, Allied ships and aircraft began to catch U-boats before or during their attacks. Arguably, the greatest Allied weapon was intelligence. From 1941 onward, Allied codebreakers were decrypting German U-boat communications, ultra-intelligence. This secret advantage let Admiralty planners know the positions of many U-boat patrol lines. Convoys were rerouted away from danger zones, and naval forces could be scrambled to ambush. For example, when large wolf packs threatened at sea, support groups lay in wait, sometimes even turning the tables and sinking multiple subs at once. The Germans fought back with better codes. In early 1942, the U-boat force upgraded to a 4-rotor Enigma, and for a time blinded Allied decrypts. But by mid-1943, British and American codebreakers had once again cracked communications, resuming the gain of vital information. Above all, Allied industrial power proved decisive. American shipyards took up the slack. By late 1942, US and Canadian yards were launching merchant hulls faster than submarines could sink them. Liberty ships rolled out on assembly lines, one a day or more, and dozens of purpose-built escort ships entered service each month. In 1943 alone, the Allies would produce nearly 3 times the tonnage lost to the U-boats. Every month after mid-1942 saw new ships restored to convoys. Pooling this industrial strength, the Allies were unwittingly winning a numbers game. Britain and its allies simply could not be starved out when new ships and escorts constantly replenished losses. By 1943, the balance was starting to swing. Allied defences, long-range planes, radar, escorts, and intelligence were closing every gap in the Atlantic. American B-24 Liberator bombers and British B-17s began flying anti-submarine patrols from Newfoundland and the Azores, eliminating the mid-Atlantic gap that had been safe for U-boats. New escort carriers accompanying every convoy meant air cover virtually everywhere at sea. U-boats could no longer surface with impunity. The climax came in early 1943. In March, wolfpacks inflicted their greatest Allied tonnage losses in a single month, totaling over 500,000 tons sunk, a last final show of U-boat dominance. This would mark the last high point for the U-boats, as counterattacks grew more ferocious in the coming months. In May 1943, known as Black May, U-boat losses became catastrophic. In one desperate month, the Kriegsmarine lost 41 submarines, nearly a quarter of its force, while convoys took much lighter punishment. On Dönitz's orders, most U-boats were withdrawn from the Atlantic by June 1943. After May 1943, the U-boat campaign was never the same. On a typical patrol after mid-1943, a U-boat was more likely to be sunk than to sink a ship. German crews reported that long days on station, fierce air attacks, and relentless hunting wore them down. The Kriegsmarine rushed new technologies, acoustic torpedoes, and new radar detectors, but these came too late. In mid-1943, a handful of prototype Type 21 electroboot was designed to operate almost entirely submerged. However, this revolutionary design came too late to have any effect, with only 2 being pressed into service before the war ended. By late 1943, the ruthless effectiveness of Allied convoy tactics was clear. Supply ships crossed the ocean in massive, heavily defended formations, backed by air patrols day and night. The Atlantic convoys increasingly reached their destinations intact. Each month, U-boats sank fewer ships. By the summer of 1943, the once overpowering U-boat threat had been largely tamed. In 1944, the U-boat menace collapsed entirely. Allied technological and tactical supremacy became absolute. By then, the US, British, and Canadian navies had enough planes and ships to hunt German subs around every shipping route. Any U-boat straying into the Atlantic or Arctic was quickly found. German submarines largely ceased major Atlantic operations. Many new U-boats were delayed, destroyed in dockyards by Allied bombing, or trapped in port by minefields. Dönitz did what he could. In late 1944, he put nearly all surviving U-boats to sea. Germany hurried crews through rushed training, trying to recoup the losses of their experienced veterans. By early 1945, the German Navy was out of material and fuel. U-boats often limped home short on torpedoes. Meanwhile, Allied anti-submarine effort never relaxed. Patrol aircraft hunted every port exit. In April 1945, the US and British fleets even formed hunter-killer groups to guard the Norwegian Sea against last U-boat sorties. Despite these heavy defences, a few desperate final operations still sank a couple dozen Allied ships into 1945. But it was too little to change the war. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Admiral Dönitz ordered all remaining U-boats to cease attacks and surface. Of the 1,162 submarines built during the war, about 785 had been lost, along with roughly 30,000 men. The U-boat fleet was dead, marking the end of undersea war. The German U-boat campaign was one of the defining struggles of World War II. Had the submarines succeeded in cutting Britain off from food and fuel, the war could have taken a very different course. In 1943 alone, the U-boats sank over 6 million tons of shipping, enough to have critically undermined Britain if the Allies had not replaced it. Britain's survival until late 1943 depended on grit and luck. and on the industrial and technological surge that eventually overcame the U-boat menace. In total, almost 3,000 merchant ships and 175 warships fell victim to U-boats in World War II, more than 15 million tons of Allied shipping. On the German side, about 40,000 men served in the submarine fleet, and nearly 30,000 never returned. The campaign's severity was summed up by Winston Churchill. "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. Ultimately, victory in the Battle of the Atlantic required the full might of Allied science, industry, and cooperation. Radar, sonar, and code breaking, combined with massive ship production, proved decisive. By mid-1943, the tonnage game swung irreversibly. The Allies could replace losses faster than the U-boats could sink them. The campaign taught harsh lessons about the importance of protecting supply lines. It refined convoy warfare, coastal blackouts, and anti-submarine tactics that navies would study for decades. Although the undersea war ended in defeat for Germany, its legacy lasted. It showed how critical maritime logistics are to global war. The Allies' success in the Atlantic ensured that millions of men and tons of material continued to flow to Britain, North Africa, and Western Europe, enabling the D-Day invasions and final victory. The U-boat campaign also spurred post-war submarine technology. Lessons from the Type 21 would influence modern submarine design. In the end, the U-boat campaign nearly snuffed out Allied fortunes, but ultimately, its own strengths were overwhelmed by Allied innovation and resources. The memory of that struggle, the loneliness of the submarine patrols, and the desperate sea battles endures as a testament to how undersea warfare shaped the outcome of World War II.